Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about paleography. Paleography is the skill that is interpreting handwritten records. And I did a video last year about this, and we're going to cover some of the same basic tips and tricks. But a lot of you have told me that one of the ways that you learn best is through specific examples or case studies. So along with some of those same basic tips and tricks, today I'm actually going to share with you some documents that have tripped me up in my research. One as recently as this weekend, that some of these skills might have come in handy if I had remembered them and applied them in the moment. Now obviously I figured it out eventually, but combined with the genealogical proof standard, good paleography skills are something that can serve all genealogists. So let's go ahead and dive in. Let's talk first about indexes. So indexes are created, for Ancestry anyway, by professional keyers in most instances. So people who have been well trained in paleography so that they can interpret the documents that they're given and create an index for them. Now in some cases, our indexes are created by people through the Ancestry World Archives project. Those are just community contributors, and those records are reviewed and arbitrated in such a way that we try to get them as accurate as possible. Now, with that said, there is still sometimes errors that creep in. Sometimes two people can look at the exact same record and it can tell two different stories to those two different people because their perspective is different. Maybe their information about the family is different. Maybe their context of the record is different. And so one of the things you need to be careful of is assuming that the index is always correct. Now, if you found the record, the index did its job, because that's the job of the index, is to get you to the record. But once you're viewing that original record itself, you need to be careful that you don't let what the indexer entered cloud your thinking or your judgment. So here is the example from my own research just this past week. I have a woman in my tree. Her name's Arana Frances Meek, and I was looking for her husband, looking for information about them. I had found a marriage index, and the marriage index listed that J.W. Pointer married Arana Frances, or AF, actually it said in the index, Meek. And so then I started looking for them in the census and found them in the same county. So this couple both lived in the same county, were married in the same county, died in the same county. That's Carroll County, Arkansas. If you've spent any time with me in the past, you know that a lot of my family is from there. And so here I find this couple in this record, and this is, nearing the end of their life. And here this says that JW stands for John W. Their last name, which is Pointer, is actually indexed Paynin. And if I zoom in on this record just a little bit, you can see how that is possible. Paynan, right? Paynor. Those two things look very, very similar. But I found the record, and so again, the index did its job and it got me to the record. This is Francis, and then here we have John W. Now, if I go back another decade into the 1910 census, let me zoom in on this one. You're going to see again, here is this couple, John W. and his wife AF, Arana Frances. This time the index was indexed, or the name was indexed as Paynor, Paynor. Here again we have John W. Back one more decade into the 1900 census, all still right there in that same county in northwest Arkansas. Here we have, again, the Paynors. There's John Paynor, Arena, and then a couple of children and a lodger that actually is her sister, I believe, if I remember correctly. So, very consistent, except for the 1920 census with the last name, that this man's name is John W. Again, the marriage index that I found listed the record as JW as the name of the groom. So I think I found the family. And then I go back into to look a little bit, learn a little bit more about him and his place of origin. And I come across a Pointer family, and there is John And here's the problem that I ran into. John in this record is a little bit older than I expected him to be. The John that I had that was married to my particular Fanny or Frances was a little bit younger, and so I was a little bit confused about that. But one of the things you have to do with the genealogical proof standard is do a reasonably exhaustive search. So I've been collecting not just census records, but marriage records and Civil War service records and everything for this gentleman, trying to make sure that I've got the right guy and the right family and the right time and the right place. Madison County is where they are living in 1870, and that's right next to Carroll County. But I've got this discrepancy. In the genealogical proof standard, we talk about needing to resolve conflicting evidence. Now, being off by a couple of years on a birth date might not be that big of a deal, but then one of the things that I discovered was I actually found a John in Madison County in the 1880 census who was married to someone else. And I knew that my John had gotten married in 1873 to my cousin, Fanny Meek. And so I was a little bit confused by that. So I actually traced that John pointer all the way through his life just to make sure I had the right guy, and found a death record for him. And it turns out that that John is the son of George and Martha. So I thought, well, maybe I have the wrong family. I went and looked for another John Pointer living in the area in 1870. His 1873 marriage record said he was from there, that he lived in Carroll County, and I could not find another John Pointer anywhere. Well, then I decided to figure out what happened to my John and Frances. I traced them to their death. Actually found a death index record for John that listed that he died in 1922. And then I went looking for a tombstone. And I found a tombstone. The problem is that this particular tombstone listed his name as Jehu, Jehu, not John, John. Well, I remembered that name sounded vaguely familiar, and so I went back here to this 1870 census, and there is a brother in this family named Jehu. Now, in the 1870 census, his name is spelled Jewhew, but he's the right age. So I went back and reviewed these records again, and I'm going to just zoom in and hope that my screen is clear enough. I'm recording this in high def. Hopefully YouTube allows me to upload it at that particular rate. But if you look at this name here, even though it's been indexed John, even though I read John, you can see here that this is actually Jehu. And if you look at some of these other records, you're going to see that what we thought was John is actually Jehu, Jehu. And that made perfect sense when compared with the tombstone that listed Jehu and Frances with the appropriate death dates and her obituary that let me know that she was died the right date that's on the tombstone. All of these things were these preconceived notions based on this name and based on the indexing that I just assumed her husband's name was John. But again, when you look at the record closely, once you know Jehu, it's a little bit more clear. Now, I never would have figured that out if I had stuck in my head that his name was John, if I had stuck to that. There were some clues that maybe that wasn't his name. Now, I hit a brick wall when I was looking for his tombstone for a while, and that brick wall could have stood if I hadn't been as persistent as I am, that I would not have been able to find a death record or a burial record for this couple because I was looking for a John. And clearly on the tombstone it states that his name is Jehu. So I use that example just as a cautionary tale that just because the index says something, just because your own eyes tell you something, oftentimes we have to use this genealogical proof standard principle of a reasonably exhaustive search and resolving conflicting evidence. If the evidence conflicts, you have to be able to explain why it conflicts. And in this case, I was having a hard time explaining the age gap. I was having a hard time explaining the not being able to find a tombstone when everybody else in the family had one and was buried in that same cemetery. And when I finally was able to look at his family of origin and recognize that he had a brother, that the John that I was looking at, that I thought I was looking at, had a brother with a name that was spelled similarly or looked similar when written, I was able to resolve all of that. Now, that also meant that I had to look back into this guy's life and forward into this guy's life. And all of that was important in helping to solve this particular problem. But I use that, there's a whole bunch of lessons in there about the genealogical proof standard, but I use that just as an example that we need to be careful and not assume that the index is correct. The other thing we need to be sure we're doing is that we're reading the document letter by letter instead of trying to read the entire word. Our brains naturally have been trained to read words. And so even sometimes when the letters are mixed up or aren't exactly what we think they should be, we still read that word the way it is. One of the benefits of the professional indexers that Ancestry uses is that they are trained to read documents letter by letter, which means that there's no preconceived notions about what that word should be. In the case of John versus Jehu, I was reading it as a word. And so once I reminded myself letter by letter, it was really clear in some of those cases that that O was an A or that N was actually a U. Another thing you need to get in the habit of doing is comparing the writing that you're looking at, if you can't read it or if you're struggling with it or if it doesn't make sense, with the other writing on the page. Now, very often I see people clip things, snip out a piece of a document and put it up on Facebook and say, what does this say? Can anybody read this? And the very first question that most experienced genealogists and paleographers will do is they will say, well, I need a link to the original image. I need to see the whole thing in context. Because being able to compare letters on the page or how that particular individual wrote things is really important. Now, this is a Tennessee state marriage record that I came across doing some collaborative research this last week with one of my colleagues, and we came across this record and we were looking at it. And the first thing, of course, is that this looks like it says Harvey Netty, N-E-T-E-Y, and he is a colored individual, and they annotated that anytime colored people got married in Tennessee at this time period. And then his wife here, Eva Moffett, or Moffin, or Moffer, or Moffus, right? So lots of different ways that this record can be interpreted. Again, we had to do some things in context. Now, this particular record is all for this couple, but context is sometimes not just about the same page. Sometimes it's about multiple pages. And so we could go to the next record on the page. These are ledgers where two pages face each other, and there's one marriage recorded per page. We can go to the next image or the previous image and check it out. And so we started doing that, and we were able to finally translate or read the handwriting that this says Harvey Utley, U-T-L-Y, and that they just crossed the T high, and the L has a loop here, so U-T-L-E-Y, U-T-L-E-Y, and that this woman's name is actually Ira, E-R-A, not Eva, E-V-A. And then in this case, they just didn't even cross the T at all. This last name is Moffett. Now, again, the way that we're able to tell that is looking at other handwriting on the page or in the set of images, and also by doing that reasonably exhaustive search. We went and found this couple in other records and were able to ascertain the last name of Harvey and the first name of Ira. A little bit more research allowed us to uncover the maiden name of Ira and compare it to other records. So sometimes you have to recognize that even if what you're reading on the page, if you think you know what this is, Netty, N-E-T-E-Y, if you're looking for Harvey Netty and you're not finding him, your own interpretation of that handwriting may have created your brick wall. And so be willing to be a little bit flexible with what you're seeing, that what you're seeing might not be exactly what you think you're seeing. Now, another thing about this particular record that was confusing to us or caused us a little bit of consternation was on the return down here at the bottom, it has something written crosswise, and it's in a different ink, or a different, it's a different weight of ink. So I can tell that it was written at a different time, and we had a hard time reading it. Now that I know what it says, I can see it really clearly, but at the time, we really struggled trying to read this. Reported to hear something. And we struggled with that. We actually sent it to a couple of pro-genealogy colleagues up at Ancestry, pro-genealogists. Some of them had a hard time reading it. Finally, we decided to just start going through the images one by one. Now, this particular image set, you can see down here at the bottom, only has 10 images. So we actually went through the entire year's worth of images, just quickly flipping through them, looking for any other notations that were similar. And we actually found several. And we found them, every 10 or 20 pages throughout the year, we found a similar thing written. And we finally were able to read it on one of the documents, and it says reported to here inclusively. And we still didn't know what that meant. We didn't know if it had to do with the particular marriages that it was written on. And so we looked at those marriages independently and tried to see, is there something the same about these records that's different about the records that don't have this notation? We couldn't find anything. Finally, we found on some records a little notation, another notation that said do not publish. And between all of us, we were finally able to come up with kind of a concept, and Paul Graham should be credited for this, but the idea is that the clerk was reporting these marriage licenses to the local newspaper. And some of them, either the couple requested or for whatever reason were do not publish licenses. And then once they had reported to the newspaper, they just made the notation, reported to here inclusively. To this point, everything inclusively has been reported to the local paper. And so that's why that notation would show up periodically. So it turns out that this particular notation had nothing at all to do with this particular marriage. It had to do with what the clerk was doing with the complete collection of records. But we wouldn't have known that if we hadn't understood the background of the document, if we hadn't reviewed a larger set of images. So again, sometimes that reasonably exhaustive search and the ability to read what is written on those records has to do with understanding the background of the document, has to do with reviewing more records than just the singular record that you're looking at. Okay, last couple of tips. Again, this is just a review, mostly from a video that I did last year where I go into a little bit more detail about some of these items individually. But in this video, I wanted to just make sure I shared with you some examples. A lot of you, like I said, have said that those case studies or those examples are a great way for you to learn. So don't expect standardized spelling. As you saw, Jehu's name was spelled Jewhew when he was a child living with his parents. As he grew, it just was spelled Jehu. And spelling was not standardized by our ancestors, not for first names, not for last names, not for locations even. When we were doing, I believe it was the 1900 census, we had 21 different ways that the state of California was spelled or abbreviated on census records by enumerators. So don't expect standardized spelling, and recognize that sometimes that person that you're looking at could be the right person, or it could be somebody entirely different. Sometimes you just need fresh eyes, and whether those fresh eyes are the eyes of someone else or whether you need to step away from it and come back later. Ultimately, that's what happened with me and Jehu. I was frustrated, and I'd hit that brick wall, and I wasn't quite sure what I was doing. And then when I came back to it the next day, things made a little bit more sense, and I was able to put the pieces together. And then, as I said, make sure you understand the background of the document that you're working with. Understand the context in which it was created. One of the things that we sometimes forget as we're doing genealogy is that these records that we use for family history purposes were not created for family history purposes. purposes. They were created for government purposes or religious purposes that have nothing to do with those of us who are researching our family history. And so we have to look at them in the context in which they were created, and sometimes things make a lot more sense at that point. Well, that's all I have for you today. Hopefully this little case study has been useful for you and a good reminder maybe to go back and take a look at some of those documents that you've used in coming to your conclusions, especially on some of those brick walls. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.